And um, I, I welcome you. So today we're going to be talking about um, David Goggins' book. Um, Now, I learned about David Goggins from my friend Chris here, and Chris actually did presentations actually two presentations on David Goggins' book at our live meetup. But I think it's a very important topic, and it's particularly relevant topic today. And so what we are going to do today, let me tell you about the format. We are going to start with Chris talking about the book. It's very informal kind of a talk, maybe 10 minutes or so. Then I'll ask him some questions, and then we will open it up for questions. There is a chat window. If you put, right in the center of your Zoom at the bottom, there is a chat window. You can keep asking questions over there, even while Chris is talking. And then we will do the questions from everybody. And after we are done, we will divide into small groups so we can discuss this topic in greater amount of detail, okay, and in a much more free flow format. So that's our format of the meetup, and that's the format of all meetups. So there is typically a presentation, then Q&A, and then we have these breakout rooms so that we can have a back and forth. It's a crucial way of developing community. All right, so with that, let me hand it over to Chris. Chris, take your time. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. So some of you might have heard me give this presentation and talk about this book before, so I apologize if it's repetitive. But my goal is really, I'm just going to give very briefly a little bit of the background of the book and then highlight some of the takeaways, at least the takeaways things that stood out to me. Really, my goal is to interest you enough that you decide to maybe buy the book or listen to it. This is the one case where I would plug the audiobook, because the audiobook is like a combination of the actual book being read, but it also includes the author himself, and they go into greater detail. So it's almost like a book mixed with a podcast. So if you are intrigued by it, that's actually a good way to be introduced to David Goggins and to consume the book itself, because you're going to get a lot more detail, a lot more stories, and I think it'll just be more enjoyable in general. So really, this book, its genesis starts with another book and with actually another person, another author. So there is a book called My Life with a SEAL. It's 31 days training with the toughest man on the planet. And that book was written by a man named Jesse Iser. And Jesse Iser, you might be familiar with him. He's an author, but also he is an entrepreneur, and he's written other books. He spent 30 days with a Buddhist monk in constant meditation. He's done a variety of things. But Jesse is also a runner. And Jesse and a bunch of his friends, they signed up to do a 100-mile race as like a relay. So with this particular race, it's 100 miles that needs to be completed in 24 hours. And you can spread that out amongst however many people you want to make a team. And in an interview, he talks about how he shows up to this race. He has his whole crew of people, and they begin to get prepared, right? They have all their gear. They have all of anything that they would need for this 24-hour window. You need to bring your own supplies. And he says, as he's looking at his area, he said that, it looked like they were going to be there for a week. That's how prepared they were. And then he starts to take stock of the other people that are going to be racing this race with him, against him, he's competing with. And he sees this one man, and he said the guy stuck out to him because he was really big, like over 6 feet tall, and just real heavy, muscular. Just not the ideal person you see at a race like this. And he said that as the race began, he kept an eye on this man, and he kind of followed his pace and followed him as he did this. And even when the race was completed and everyone was going home, he said something about this guy, this stranger who he had never met. Something about him stayed with him for days, for weeks. Like an image was burned into his mind. And it began to possess him to such a degree that he found a way to find who this person was and to reach out to him. Because in the interview, he says, if I could get whatever this guy had, whatever quality, whatever this frequency he was humming at, if I could get just a little bit of that, then all of these goals I had set for myself in life, I would be better able to achieve. So he reached out to this man, and this man turned out to be David Goggins. And he invited David into his home to live with him and to train with him, and his hope was to kind of absorb something. In the book, My Life with a SEAL, this man is referred to as SEAL because David Goggins was still in the military at that time. But now we know that guy is David Goggins, and David Goggins went on to write his own story and to tell, his trials and his turbulations through his life, and the certain decisions he had to make and the certain mental gymnastics he needed to do in order to become the person he became. And for me, this book, it really struck me, and I've read it. I read it once, and I think I've read it twice. And for me, fear has always been an element in my life due to a variety of different things. And reading this book and seeing this guy and how he was able to persevere through his own fears was very liberating for me. You see, David Goggins grew up in very bad environments. Like anything that could go wrong in a person's life went wrong in his life. From a child, right, born into a horrible family dynamic with an abusive father, just being beat on mentally, physically, and all of the damage that it did a number on him. And he talks about in the book how there was a moment of clarity where he realized that the only way he was going to be able to change his circumstance was to embrace all of his fears and pain. You see, in the book, it's funny because both Jesse Iser and his book, My Life with a SEAL, and David Goggins and his book, they both talk about a pinnacle moment in both of their lives. And the moment is the same moment. And it's very fascinating, right? Jesse talks about seeing this guy run 100 miles with no one to help him, with no supplies. And that changed the course of Jesse's life, right? Because that led him to go and seek out David Goggins. But that race was also a pinnacle moment in David Goggins' life. You see, this book, and I think one of its major criticisms, is that the guy is kind of like a meathead. He'll identify himself, he identifies himself in the book as a knuckle dragger, right? A roughneck, not an intellectual, right? His whole life has been one of physicality. He's in the military. He's a firefighter. He's a marathon runner. All of these very physical things. But he talks about when he was running this 100 miles, and this 100 miles nearly killed him. It's not a smart thing to do. You should never try to run 100 miles without any notice, without preparation. But he did it. And he says as he's running this race, and his mind is attacking him because his brain, his being, his unconscious is saying, why are you doing this? You don't need to do this. This is foolish. This is dumb. You should stop. He said in that moment, a switch went off in his head. And he realized that pain and fear, in many cases, they didn't have true power on him. The only power they had was the power that he gave them. And in that moment, running this 100 miles, where he literally was beginning to, for lack of it, he was beginning to die, he realized that he could go further than he ever thought, and that the thing that was holding him back his whole life, it was fear. And he says it in the book, it was fear, and it was fear of pain. He didn't want to have to struggle to get to the goal, to get to the finish line, to accomplish the things that he wanted in his life. It was a barrier that had held him back. And the moment he identified it, running this race, he said it was like he had achieved a power, like a superpower. And he began to go through his life and ask himself, what are the things, how many things have I been leaving on the table because I've been afraid? Or I'm afraid of the pain. I'm afraid of what people will think. And he began to realize that he had been holding himself back his whole life. And really the book, in a nutshell, is that story. It's that awakening, that realization. And it's not an intellectual story. It's not a philosophical story. It is the story of someone who, in all aspects of his life, has been a struggle, academically, physically. If you look at the cover of the book, anyone who's checked it out on Amazon, you see two pictures, and they're the same man, right? It's David Goggins. One is a very heavy man, and one is David Goggins in his Navy SEAL dress whites. So that book, that story, it struck me because I'm listening to someone, or I'm watching someone who learned through the trials of pain and suffering, and what that did, how he was able to distill that into certain mental shifts in his thinking, I think is something that we can all at least strive to do, not in his way, but in our own ways. So some of the key concepts that stood out to me was one, it's called the 40% rule. And both David Goggins in his book Can't Hurt Me, and also Jesse Iser in his book, My Life with a SEAL, they talk about this 40% rule. And David, through his own trials, realized that when his brain started to attack him, when it started to tell him to stop, you're going to hurt yourself, you've gone too far, he realized that really he'd only achieved 40%, right? He had more in the tank, and he always had more in the tank. And that was something that he taught Jesse Iser. And there's a funny story in the book where he's talking about Jesse Iser, and he's saying how, one of the first days when he went to go live with Jesse, they go to the gym. And, David says to Jesse, I kind of want to see where you are so we can kind of set a progress for this 31 days. I want to know where you start, what's zero, so I can get you to as far as we can go. And one of the tests that David gave to Jesse was to do a pull-up, a simple thing. I think we all can visualize what a pull-up is. And Jesse, he does a pull-up. And he asked Jesse to do as many pull-ups as he could do, right? In this case, it was maybe 5 or 6. And then Jesse jumps back down from the bar, looking to David, kind of hoping for congratulations, good job. And David says, all right, go back up, take your 30 seconds and go and see how far you can go now. All right, so he jumps back up, maybe he does 2 or 3 more pull-ups, drops back down. Okay, that's good, Jesse. Let's do it again, and let's do it again. And then David confronts him with a challenge. He says, we're not going to leave the gym until you've done 100 pull-ups. And it's funny because if you read the story, Jesse looks at him almost in a state of like bewilderment. Like, this is not possible. You've seen how much I've struggled with these very few, let's say 10 pull-ups. Now you're asking me to do 90 more. It's not possible. And David says, no, we're going to do it. And little by little, minute by minute, maybe hour by hour, Jesse was able to get to his 100. And that was how David kind of showed him that, hey, what you think you can do and what you can do, 2 different things. Half of it is believing. So that was one of like the key ideas really of the whole book and of David Goggins' life, because struggle and failure are a major component of the book, right? When I look at some people, I tend to think of them as like good at everything. Right? This is not one of those people. Everything he accomplishes in the book started with a failure. I want to say literally everything he accomplishes in the book was on the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th try, right? Getting into the Navy SEALs took him, I think, 3 tries. He accomplished some different records, 3, 4 tries. Everything, story after story is about failing, reevaluating, trying again, reevaluating, trying again, till he succeeded. And he says it in many places in the book. That was a learning process. It was a process of learning that failure is never the end. It's just a checkpoint where you say, all right, this is what I did. What was the outcome? How can we reevaluate? How can we tweak this process and try again? And I know for myself, that is something I don't do. I tend to stop when things get hard, when something doesn't come naturally, when in fact that's really the beginning of the journey. It's not an end point. That's where you begin. So that was a key component of the book, is that, failure is fundamental. Failure, if you're afraid of failure, you'll never achieve, because most of us are not good at things the first try. It takes, concerted long-term effort to become good at something. And I think for myself, that was like a wake up saying, hey, you have to turn, you have to turn the ship into the storm, into the wind, because that's how you're going to learn the biggest and best lessons that will get you closer and closer to whatever goal you want to achieve. And it doesn't need to be physical, any goal. And in that failure, there's going to be pain. That's one of his biggest lessons. One of the biggest highlights of that is that anything that's worth something, anything that you're going to have to try and struggle, there's going to be pain. It might not be physical pain. It might be emotional pain. It might be psychological pain. The pain of trying to learn something that's very hard is trying. And for him, he had to teach himself to turn into the pain and almost use it as a navigational device. It meant, all right, if I'm afraid of this, if I'm afraid of the pain, I'm afraid what it's going to cost me to accomplish this goal, that means that's the direction I need to go in. So there's a great, line in the book, and you'll see is that this man, education was a trial for him. He could not learn, whether he had a developmental disability or just due to the stress and strain of growing up. Teaching and learning were a trial. It almost was akin to physical pain. And it's funny because if you flash forward, this person that could barely speak, who stuttered, who could not get a sentence out, through trial, through pain, through struggle, he became at one point one of the military's, one of the Navy's greatest speakers. He was the guy you sent out to talk about the Navy, to try to get people to to come and join the Navy. So without being repetitive, those were some of the key ideas, right? That you have to turn into the pain. You can't avoid it if you want those things, those goals. If you want to accomplish them, there's going to be pain, and there should be pain, right? Because anything that's worth its weight is going to have a trial, right? The things that come easy to us in life, we usually throw away, we cast to the side. And the things that we struggle and we have to strive for are the things we value in many cases the longest, maybe to the end of our life. And I think that's true because in this world of abundance that we live in, even with the circumstances that we find ourselves in now, there is still that relationship between what is the easy road and the hard road. And I think the more people you talk to, I always think it's a truth, right? The people, the trial, the road that takes you down the bumpy path is usually the thing that people talk about when they're 80 years old, when they look back on their life. That's one of those things that they had to wrestle to gain. And therefore it leaves a deeper memory. So I don't know if that's 10 minutes or so, but that's the general idea of the book.
Wow. So Chris, this is the first book that I've had 3 different meetups on. And the reason for that is that there is something about this book. And for me, the thing that I walked away with was a very simple idea. This very simple question. And that is, what am I leaving on the table? What am I leaving on the table? Because what happens is that, all of us are kind of afraid of many things. And all of us are kind of scared of pain and failures and all kinds of negative things. And what David Goggins' story demonstrates better than anything else I've seen. It's actually a very simple point, is that most of the limits that we think we have are mostly our own creation of those limits. I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't any limits, but most of the things that we think are limiting us are kind of self-generated. And those are actually not even as limits. We are just afraid of reaching the limit, or we are afraid of the possibility of pain. So it's not even fear, it's fear of fear. It's not even pain, it's a pain of seeing possibility of a pain. It's not even failure, it is kind of feeling that I might fail. And the extent to which it stops people, the extent to which it stops me is so large that this basic idea that he has, that is what is stopping people, and you need to go past that. You need to have the courage, you need to have the will to go through the pain, the fear, the failures, to get to where you want to go. And if you do that, you usually surprise yourself, because we don't know what we can do. Our limits are not very known. We are very complex creatures. We don't know our limits, and we just kind of quickly come up with some limits, and we try to say, okay, that's what the limits are, and then remain within that comfort zone. So that's what I got from the book, of just the question, what am I leaving on the table?
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. And the funny thing is, like, I was doing a talk about Michael Jordan recently, and it's, I like the David Goggins book because you're right. It boils it down very simply. And it's an idea that a lot of people have figured out. Anyone who I think is a high achiever, there was pain involved, and they had to figure out how to seek it and go towards it rather than doing what a lot of us, myself very much included, do, which is to go in the opposite direction, go towards comfort. And I know for myself, the fascinating thing is that you do that thinking it will lead you towards better feelings. I don't want to say happiness, but it's that you'll feel good, right? Pain is bad. The opposite feels good. But the reality is, I think it's quite the opposite. The things that are the hardest and that cost the most of you, either physically or mentally or emotionally, you value, you hold on to them the most. But it takes effort because pain is not fun. I mean, no one enjoys pain. I don't think David Goggins enjoys pain. I've listened to him in interviews. He's like, I don't like to do this. He's like, when he does something that's very radical, maybe it's waking up early, it's going for a run, and it's like a blizzard out. These things that are kind of seem ridiculous. It's not like he's enjoys pain. It's not like he gets off on it. It's that he realizes that it's something he needs to do in order to be his best self, to find what his limits are. And his life became a pursuit of finding his limits and realizing that the harder he pushed himself, the further away he was from his limit. That it's actually, like you said, it was, oh, I thought that was my limit. Oh, no, it's a little bit further. 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 And I think that's an interesting realization. Now, again, for anyone who has read this book, there are some downsides to his way of being. So you definitely got to take the good with the bad. But I do think that idea, that lesson of, though, when you feel that internal clench at the idea of something, maybe it's a new hobby or a new pursuit, then that means that's where you got to go. That's the direction. That is in fact the absolute. That is the pursuit you need to focus on. And it's something that's like, oh, that'll be easy. That'll be an easy an easy win. That's the opposite. Because that means whatever it took to accomplish it, you've already achieved it. The thing you're afraid of, you're not there yet. That means that there's space for you to grow.
Another point, and this is a very interesting point. The point is that the book is about will, the power of will. And because he's demonstrating this point in the context of physical action, you can actually see it. And it's quite stunning. Like, he is basically kind of falling apart as he is doing a marathon. I mean, I can't even imagine the pain. And so and it is easy to see the point at the level of physical things because you can actually visualize it.
Yes.
But the same point applies at the mental level, at the emotional level. And so for me, it was very useful to see the point demonstrated in the physical way and then apply it to the mental, and how you can also see the kind of connection between physical and mental. So that was one thing. It's the most simple, demonstrable way, in examples which are actually quite stunning, like quite kind of scary, to see how a human being can actually do that. And then you kind of ask yourself, wait a minute, so what's it that I was afraid of now? And why? So I thought that it actually illustrates that extremely well. Let me open it up to questions. So folks, we have a relatively small group. So you can either type your questions. Anybody who types the questions gets the gets the priority. So I would recommend that you type the question. Otherwise, you can also raise your hand. So those, in Zoom, there is a button to raise the hand. You can do that too. So the first question is from Roman. Roman, go ahead. Just one thing, just as a point of order. So what you do is that you keep yourself muted. When you're asked to ask a question, go ahead and unmute yourself, ask the question, and then mute yourself back. We have got 4 rules that we have used in this meetup for the past 3.5 years, which have worked very, very well for us to create a really engaging discussion where everybody participates. 4 rules. Number 1, raise your hand when you want to speak. You can do that by either typing or raising your hand in Zoom, or you can even raise your hand if you're on video. I'll come to you. Number 2, keep on topic. Okay, we're always talking about a particular topic. Keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. There's a lot of people who have a lot of interesting things to say, and you want to hear all of that. So please be brief. And number 4, be courteous. Feel free to disagree with anything that anybody is saying, but do so courteously. Okay, so those are the 4 rules. All right, so with that, over to you, Roman. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I guess I was just curious what pain means in or what David Goggins is talking about when he talks about pain in a non-physical sense. I'm sure it was probably answered in the book, but I didn't end up reading it. So if you know the answer to that, that would be great.
Cool. Can you want me to answer, Shrikant?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, cool.
Chris, you take the questions. You know this much better than I do. Go ahead.
So I can give you one. So like in the book, Shrikant said it pretty well. The book pretty much highlights a lot of physical that you can apply, definitely mentally. But even in the book, there's examples. So he talks about in his military career. A lot of that is academic. Like you have to do, it's not physical. You have to learn things. There's tests. You have to study documents and whatnot. And he talks about in the book how like that was something that did not come easy to him. I don't believe is diagnosed, but I think he's self-diagnosed with a learning disability. So he just couldn't, he had a lot of difficulty learning. And he realized he learned under very particular circumstances that just wouldn't work in the long term. So for example, in this case, when he's in the military and he's having to learn like just books of information, strategy and whatnot, he would, when all of his buddies and all his fellow SEALs would go out and they'd have recreational time, he would be spending hours upon hours literally reading and writing the whole book. Like word for word. And his whole thing was, it's the same with, I think the pain applies 100% mentally, because that stuff does take a toll to force yourself to sit for hours and just write and try to learn and process. Like, that is a grueling task. It might not be physically painful, but I would imagine that yeah, you're going to feel a degree of mental pain, and it's going to be a struggle to force yourself to do that. So there are examples like that that are not physical, that are a mental effort, an effort of sheer will over the mind, that you would find in the book. So I think he would say that what he learned in the physical realm, he applies 100% to anything that would be mental. He says, there's a great line in in a podcast, I think, or he pretty much was, he was at a talk with someone, and pretty much it was a bunch of scientists. And he said to them, he said, you better worry if I get tired of running ultra marathons and don't decide to become a scientist. Because he's of the mind now, it's like anything he wants to accomplish, obviously there's within reason, he believes he can accomplish through effort, whether it's mental effort or it is physical effort. It's just that, his life is is in the physical realm, but he's not of the mind that, hey, I can't do that. I don't have the ability to do that. Because I think he believes that a lot of things are not about ingrained ability. They're about perseverance, will, and if you're willing to put in the time and energy. And for him, for something he cares about, whatever it is, he is willing to make those sacrifices, whether it's in the mental arena or it's in the physical arena. I don't know hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
Excellent. Next question is from Adrian. Adrian, go ahead. Adrian, you can.
Okay, yeah, I got it. So how much did his difficult childhood, like, sometimes difficult childhoods crush people, and he had a difficult childhood. Did he address how he was able to flip that, switch? Because a lot of times people get crushed.
Yeah.
And he wasn't crushed by his childhood. It almost, like, did he talk about, the impact it had on him as an adult?
Yeah. So to just expand a little bit on the story of the book, there's another highlight, and the highlight is that in his life there was no upward trajectory. It wasn't like in childhood he suffered these turmoils, and there was a moment of realization at age 14, and then that set his life on this upward trajectory forever. No. So his life, if you read the book, is getting himself out of the muck and then falling back into it again and again, and having to say, all right, we got to do this journey again. That was real hard the first time. So his childhood played a huge, I think he uses it as ammunition and fuel. Some people would be destroyed by it, but at a certain point, he learned to utilize it as a reason and a justification to push forward. And he talks about something called the cookie jar. And he's like, in this cookie jar in your head, you got to put the hard times and you got to put the good times. And they both have a usefulness that will help you in some trial. So yeah, I think for him, his childhood did help him, but I don't know if that would have came about. Like, I don't know if it's because he had a bad childhood he was able to do what he did. I don't think that's the case, because if you read the book, it could have gone in the other direction, and in many cases it almost did, and it did go in the other direction. I think it was more of a wake up. Something, a trigger happened in him. He talks about in one case when he was really heavy, really overweight, and just doing everything he could to destroy himself, right? Taking all that pain he had felt from his childhood, at some point he just wanted to self-harm, and he self-harmed through food and just bad habits. And he said he watched like a commercial for Navy SEALs, and something in that, it struck him then, and that woke him up that time. Other times it was, when he was young, he wanted to join the Air Force, and that he couldn't even tell you exactly why, but it just became an idea that possessed him. And then that got him out of the gutter when he was, let's say, 14, 15, 16 years old. So I think he learned to use it as fuel, but I couldn't tell you why. And I think he could have easily destroyed him as well if he didn't figure out how to do that mental gymnastics.
Let me add one thing. It's a very interesting story. I went to my reunion with these friends I went to college with. Now, this was after I was meeting them after 30 years. And I noticed something. And of course, this was an elite college. This is really one of the top colleges in India. All of these people are very bright. Now, there were 2 or 3 people in our group whom we had known all our lives who started with a very rough start. They were from small villages in India. They had, they're extremely poor. It took a lot for them. And when they entered the college, they really struggled. But of all the people, and most of the people had done really, really well for themselves. But these people who really had a very rough start were the ones who had done spectacularly well. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that bad situation is good. No. Bad situations can destroy. But if you do face a bad situation and you overcome it, what you gain is the confidence of being able to do that, being able to take on challenging things. And that confidence remains with you. The things that you learn in trying to overcome about yourself, you can take those lessons and apply it to other people, other things that you do. And I think that's what happens. So if you do take up a challenge and succeed in doing that, that remains with you. So then most of life's challenges you face in a very different way. So that's what I would say. Next question is by Ina. So it's going to be Ina, then John, and then Deborah. Ina, go ahead.
Yes, hi. I have 2 questions. I read the book. It's a great book. I agree completely. So I wanted to ask these 2 questions. First of all, do you think that his mother, that she played one of the major roles in his life? Because it seems to me that she was always next to him when he's running the marathons, and all the time she's supporting him, she's his biggest fan. So even though he had a difficult childhood, his mom is a really great woman. So I mean, do you think she's her encouragement helped him? That's one question. And the second one, do you think he's was really taking his physical exercises to extreme? And I would say he was on the brink of dying many times. I mean, he's incredibly lucky not to die, because especially when they discovered this hole in his heart. So I still not sure about how did it come about at the end. Also, he was very sick or something. So I mean, but do you think he was doing a little bit dangerous activity for it was extreme? Do you think it was necessary to take it that far? Or do you think it's because I'm not sure, because sometimes it's I love his drive, but on the other hand it seems a little bit too extreme. What do you think about that?
So I agree with what you said about the mother. 100%. I think that she was probably one of the few constants, I think, in his childhood and his life. And as you read the book, she fled the father and protected him. But there's towards the end of the book, if you remember when he was doing the pull-up, trying for the pull-up record, he said she was the one that when he failed, she didn't say, okay, you tried. She'd say, all right, well, what's the next step? Let's try again. She was the one already kind of amping him up for the next trial. So yeah, I mean, I agree with that 100%. I think she is a major influence in his life, 100%. And as far as the second question, yeah, 100%. It's not smart. You've read the book, and you probably listened to maybe some of his interviews. When they tell you when he tells the story of him running that 100-mile race, all of the alarm bells should go off in your head because it's not smart. I think he would admit it wasn't smart. He's not necessarily what we could say the safest, smartest guy. Like that story alone, he didn't prepare. And people who do these things, even extreme activities, there's a lot of preparation that goes. They do it in a very smart way to kind of mitigate the dangers. And in that particular example of the 100-mile race, he didn't do any of those things. And that's one example of many where he leapt before he looked. And as a lifestyle, it's probably not the smartest. But again, like you said, you read the book because I don't want to be David Goggins, but I'll let him do that stuff. But if I can just glean through osmosis some of those lessons, I can apply them to my own challenge. I'm not going to run 100 miles, but maybe I run 5, and that might be my 100 miles. And I think there's lessons that I could apply to that. But yeah, I wouldn't suggest this book to someone as like, this is how you live life. You should do all these things. Because no, like 100 people could do them and maybe 50, maybe 20% survive, because that 100-mile race could have killed another person. Yeah, I agree.
There are a whole bunch of questions, but let me ask one more question to everybody. Anybody else has read this book? You can just raise your hand if you have read the book. You can raise your hand either physically, or you can raise the hand by pressing. Okay, there is one person. Let me see. Okay, Diana, go ahead. So basically what I want to do is I want to do a round of comments from anybody who has read the book, whatever comments you have. Diana, go ahead.
Hey, thank you, Shrikant, and thank you, Christopher, for a great presentation. So I read this book, and the first time that I kind of went through it, you know, I think what really stood out for me was the level of honesty that is required in that moment. So like if we go back to when he's watching the commercial, he has a really horrible job. I believe he was what's the name of it?
He was an exterminator.
There you go, an exterminator. You know, it was a very unpleasant job, very low wage. He was just overweight. He was not happy. He was at a very miserable point. And so for me, the Navy SEAL commercial or whatever was just kind of like that moment where he took an honest look and he said, I am not happy with any of these things. And that kind of set him up to, with the running, I believe what he needed for himself was a challenge to kind of start those that he was not happy about. So that's one of the things. And then I believe, you know, Shrikant, you touched on this a bit when you were speaking about how sometimes individuals with very difficult starts, you know, once they overcome those difficulties, you know, they end up doing some pretty amazing things. And, you know, while I don't believe that it's necessary, you know, has touched on this idea. There's also like post-traumatic growth where the way that people have to function in order to survive and overcome these very difficult situations sets them up kind of with this kind of hunger, and it continues and it grows. So yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking about with this stuff. I really enjoy David Goggins. He's crazy and he's fun, and you know, so thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Next question is from John. John, go ahead. Let me just tell you the order. Give me just a second. So it's going to be John, then Deborah, then Becky, and then Roman. You can continue to line up for questions by just typing in your questions. Okay, go ahead, John.
Okay, is there more than one John, or are you speaking to me?
You're the first John to speak up, so it's you.
Okay. Well, I have to reiterate what was said just recently, in that an example is a friend of mine was pushing himself to run further. He wants to train for a marathon, and his body was starting to break down. And he went to the road runners, and the advice of the coach was, yes, you should cut back. You haven't built up certain muscles yet. You don't know, like your buttocks muscles are not strong enough, and you're putting all your strain on your hamstring. So in other words, like running the 100 miles without consideration for the proper training, in order to make this practical for people, so that they don't, injure themselves. What would be his advice about that? He seems to be the type.
Let me take that question. I think, see, the way I look at books is that I pick up whatever I can pick up from a book. I think, and the other thing that we do in our meetups all the time is what we do, what we call syntopical reading. That means you take in ideas from every source that are connected to what you're looking at, and try to integrate it all together. So I think the idea that needs to be integrated with this is the idea of the Stoic idea of dichotomy of control. You need to understand what is it that is not fully within your control, and what is it that is within your control. And you need to understand that crisply and clearly, as best as you can. So you have to have a profound humility in accepting the nature for what it is. And then, but the whole purpose of that is it's not fatalism. It is all about kind of accepting the limits and knowing where the walls are, so that you can tell where the doors are, and then doing all the effort that you can possibly do to do your best in what is within your full control. So I think so the way in which I deal with this, I understand this because is that you have to accept what the limits are. What the limits are in nature, in reality. The lesson for me is that the limits, what we think limits are, our limits are actually not what our limits are. And many of the limits that people have are psychological, based on fear, fear of pain, fear of failure, things like that. So so for me, the takeaway is that have the courage to pursue your life. Don't have false ideas about your own limits. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, and just to respond, John, the examples that are the most big and bright are not necessarily, if you read the book, you'll get a better context, but a lot of those were mistakes that he would not do again in that way. And also you could say is that, right, that 100 miles, for that example, was not the first challenge. It might have been the 55th challenge. And it's like, as you said, kind of with the running, right? The same advice that was given to your friend, right? You got to build the prerequisite skills or strengths in order to accomplish the bigger task. But each of those is a marathon in and of themselves. And over time, you stack them on top of each other, and you're able to achieve greater heights. So if you do read the book, especially towards the end, he kind of begins to explain mistakes he made. And he talks about how, right, preparation and planning, it is important. And you can kind of see that. So if I didn't convey that, that's my mistake.
The other point I would make is that, look, I mean, all of us are human beings, and all of us are trying. And there are all kinds of limits that we have, and all kinds of mistakes that we make. For me, when I'm trying to learn from another person, I'm trying to learn an idea from the other person. The fact that he made a mistake in a way in which he's doing certain things, maybe took a risk that I don't think are the right risks to take, doesn't invalidate what I can learn from him. So it is my job to find out what is the core idea that I can learn from them. So even when I say, okay, I don't think it is reasonable to take those kind of risks with your life, I certainly don't think it is worth, right thing to take the kind of risk that many times she took. It doesn't invalidate the principle that you have to push against your fear of pain, your fear of failure. Be willing to take the negative in order to pursue your goals as hard as you possibly can. So that's how I see it. Next question is by Deborah. Deborah, go ahead.
Hi, I was curious about if somebody in his life really steered him into this philosophy or epiphany that he had. Like, it sounds like it wasn't somebody at the Navy because he had a lot of challenges before, and maybe Ina answered it saying that it was probably his mother who was his biggest cheerleader and cheering him on. But I'm just curious if there was somebody who told him, no, you need to steer into the pain. No, if you're afraid of something, you need to just keep going toward it. So do you know if the book addresses that?
So if I remember correctly, honestly, in the book, I think this is one of the rare cases where there's no one really expressly mentioned as like conveying or depositing some type of philosophy that he adopted. I really don't. He makes reference to one teacher he had that he felt took extra effort to teach him in an academic environment. But this idea of pain, I think from my reading and from listening to different podcasts, it was discovered by.
Well, what I wanted to say was a lot of people don't have mentors. A lot of people don't have mentors, so quote unquote formal mentors. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
A lot of people don't have quote unquote formal mentors who tell them, you should really do this, or based on this approach. I mean, some people have good parents who are acting as mentors. Some people have good teachers who are acting as mentors. But some people don't have that, so I was just curious if the book addresses it, but it sounds like you're saying it was either his teacher or his mother. So thank you.
So let me address that for a moment. I think what happens is that that's very interesting. Like, I think, as human beings, we learn from others, and that's a core part of how we learn. So I think the idea of mentorship is very valuable, and I think that's one of the greatest things that parents can do for their children. But at the same time, I think you kind of have to choose your own mentors. Many times you have people, that are inspiring, and you have to kind of find them on your own. As a child, it may be hard, but I think over a lifetime, I think there is a difference between people who kind of seek out the best people that they can possibly find in whatever dimension and learn from them. I think that's an attitude that each person needs to have. And I think it's also important to be mentors, of kind of sharing with others what you can, what you think is possible for human beings. So I think the point about mentors is excellent. Becky, you're next.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, so if someone doesn't already have the passion or the obsession, the drive or the talent, in order to get going, how does one overcome that mental and emotional block that's stopping them? Is it out of willpower? How do you go about training your mind again to stick to your goal?
Sorry, Chris, you're on mute.
Thank you. Just speaking on David Goggins and the book in regards to that question, I think he's very much just a sheer willpower person. I would imagine, and I think you get it from the book, is maybe some of the motivations that kind of keep him pushing do stem from childhood and trying to. I think he even mentions this in the book, is that a lot of his motivations are kind of like showing people from his childhood, maybe showing his dad, who was estranged and was abusive, like, I'm worth something. I am, it's kind of proof. Like, here, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. I do believe that that was a factor in what keeps him or kept him moving forward. I don't know by the end of the book if that's still the same motivation. I think there's a transformation that takes place so that his drive forward became self-driven. I want to see where I can go. I don't care about what's going on back here. So yeah, to answer that question, it's kind of like, I do think for him, his motivation was at one point past pain and past trauma. That motivated him probably to lose weight in the beginning, to join or attempt to join the Air Force in the beginning, all of these things you see in the book. By the end of the book, I believe, my opinion, is that it became self-driven, where he was like, hey, all these things I thought I couldn't do, I can do. So how much more can I do? And that idea, that question, became the driving force that constantly, kept him focused or kept him on task, kept him pushing. So I can only speak to that as far as the book is concerned. I don't know in general, though. I don't have any other opinion.
I will add one thing. I mean, this is a question that I've found almost impossible to answer. I think people vary quite a bit, and I find that it is easy to work with people. See, I am very much pro growth, both within myself and when I'm kind of interacting with other people. What I have found is that when I see that there is a growth kind of drive from somebody, I can work with them on that particular thing and we can do something wonderful. But like, if there is no growth drive, I really don't know what to do. Part of it, the other thing I would say is that I think it is highly individual. The kinds of things that will motivate a person vary from people to people. And something that will work for one person will not work for another person. So I think each person needs to figure out what kind of context do they need to be motivated, to kind of keep going. What is it that inspires them? And they need to kind of work that out. I mean, I certainly have never been able to figure that out beyond a particular, only when I have something from the other person, I can work with them to do something. But if I don't have anything coming from the other person, I don't know what to do, really. So that's my, my take. Let me see. Next one is Andrew. Andrew, go ahead.
Sure. No, getting to Becky's question, I think it was Becky, she said, something along the lines of, how do I get the strength? Something like that. But what I'm hearing a lot of, this guy is doing all these wonderful things and pushing himself, and he's got visions of what he wants to do. Really, before all that, the hardest part is to figure out what it is you want. So that, I think that's worth emphasizing more. What is your goal? It's not necessarily clear what you actually want in the first place. What are you struggling with? What do you want to try to be doing? That's a stumbling block right there. Like, what do I want? That's a difficult question to answer. And I think in today's age, you know, where it's all about self-growth and getting better and all this kind of stuff, maybe it's not recognized or talked about enough that, you know what, actually, what's really hard is figuring out what you actually want. Forget about like trying to get the courage and strength.
The best answer I've seen to that is by Jordan Peterson. And it's a very simple answer. It's a very, it's astonishingly simple answer. And I think it works. The answer Jordan Peterson gives is that pursue your values. Don't try to kind of figure out, okay, I'm going to take a year to figure out what I want. No, don't do that. Try to figure out in the next 10 minutes what you want. Try to figure out in the next one day what you want, and actually start to do that. And because it's not like values are some kind of a entity in the other world that you need to get an insight into, like that, what are my true values? They are more of something that supports your life. And what he recommends is that you start pursuing your values as energetically as possible, even while accepting that they may not be your true values, that you may be wrong about it, because the only way you're going to figure out what your values are is through acting on the values. You will get the feedback. You'll say, no, I really don't. This is not exactly what I want. It is something different. It's like this. Or this is important and this is important. I thought both of them were the same. No. This one is particularly more important.
Well, what's an example of a value, for example? What's an example of a value?
I mean, values can be in multiple ranges. So for example, there are values, kind of social values, like your family is a value, kind of having good family relationships is a value, kind of saying producing something is a value, kind of intellectual curiosity is a value. So what he's recommending is that you pursue all your values. Values is something that you think will make your life better. And you should pursue that as aggressively as possible, as intently as possible, and use the feedback from reality and from yourself as a corrective mechanism. So this is it's basically, this is pragmatic epistemology. This is saying that it's not the truth, are these the true values? The way you figure out whether they are true values is to see if they work in action. Does this make sense? Now Diana wants to say something very, very strongly. There is first one exclamation point, and then there were two exclamation points. So Diana, over to you.
I really love how you, so I can always get so much from you, Shrikant, and I really appreciate you hosting these meetings. Value supporting your life, I think, is kind of the quote of the night from you right now. I love that. So to touch on what Andrew said, and I believe Becky's question, I think my perspective for this, it really stems down to like, if you don't know what you want, and I think Goggins goes over this, one of his approaches coming from the environment and the childhood that he came from was he knew exactly what he didn't want. And so he kind of started there. You know, he didn't want a dead-end job. He didn't want, to be overweight. He didn't want to prove people in his life correct in that he was, useless, worthless, lazy, et cetera, et cetera. And so he kind of guided himself or propelled him, used that to propel himself. He's like, well, I might not know exactly what I want, but I know what I don't want. And I think for me, that's been particularly useful. And also, there's a connection here with Peterson's ideas, because I think that they work well together. I really do see how they work well together. As far as kind of like where you get started if you don't know where you're at, and using values and the things that matter to you immediately, like what's immediately in front of you. So an example of this is I value family, right? And so if I value family, I take an honest look at the relationships that I have with the individuals in my family, how I treat them, how do I communicate with them, and so on, and the quality of that relationship. And that gives me something daily that I can work towards, that, you know, naturally kind of expands to other parts of my life. You know, am I kind to my family? Am I considerate? Am I compassionate? You know, whatever other things that matter to me, you know, I use them with what's available to me, or I practice them with what's available to me, and then it kind of has this snowball effect. So yeah.
Thank you, Diana. I think the idea of kind of getting rid of things, of saying what is it that you do not value, also is a way. I think that's a great thing. It's kind of, you know, this is Taleb calls it addition by subtraction, because what happens is that your life is limited, your time is limited, your attention is limited. Just by removing things from your life that are not of value to you is a big step towards kind of cleaning things out, so you can focus on things that may be of value to you. Roman, thank you for your patience. You're next. What I try to do is that I always give priority to the people who have not asked the questions before, but it's up to it's over to you now, Roman. Go ahead. Roman, are you there? Okay. Doesn't look like. Well, when he comes back, I will go ahead and. All right. So Becky, do you think we answered the question? I don't know whether we did a good job. We just talked about, you know, whatever we could talk about. But do you think? Do you want to do a follow-up question?
I think you addressed it quite well. With it really comes down to it being personalized to how you want to go about developing the habits, and a few people did mention, well, maybe it's the goal to begin with. Maybe there wasn't enough conviction in the goal, and to pursue your values. That's you're passionate about that innately, or to have that drive come from childhood traumas. That's even though it's external, there's still that drive there. And as the author eventually moves into something that's external to an intrinsic drive, there's still passion. So perhaps it's more about the goal. Like, we know that there are certain goals that are good for us, like let's get fit or something, but perhaps we haven't convinced ourselves enough, like these things are the benefits of it to give us that drive. But you did address my my question, Shrikant, and we've talked about it quite often. I think with habit, and always like coming back to how to develop a healthy habit and stick to it. So thank you.
Yeah. Now I would add one more thing. I think, like, most people think that the kind of development of values should be or ought to be almost automatic. Okay, I think that's a misconception. I think values are achieved in the sense that figuring out, I mean, we are complex beings. There is a lot of chaos in the world. There is a lot of chaos inside us. To actually formulate our values in a clear, crisp term is an achievement. It's a process. So a great deal of courage is needed to kind of look inside yourself and say, okay, maybe I want this. Let me see if that's true. Fail and say, okay, no, that's not what I. So even kind of creation of your own ideal, creation of your own values is an achievement. And that also has the same kind of issues involved as achievement of values. So I think both are there. Chachi, you had a point. Go ahead. Chachi, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just kind of triggered. What Diana said triggered a thought in something earlier when Christopher was talking about exercise. And even if we think of, being 40% done, say we're talking about physical pain as the example, and someone doesn't like to exercise because it causes physical pain. Where do we draw the line from saying, well, I don't like to exercise because I'm only exercising today to lift 10 pounds so that tomorrow I can lift 20 pounds, when I may never have a need to lift 20 pounds. So I don't see the point in lifting ever increasing amounts of weight just to prove that I can lift an ever increasing amount of weight. So I just don't see the point in doing that. I don't like it. So why should I pursue the pain to achieve it? And just using that analogy and applying it to anything, like pushing through the pain when we don't see the value or we just don't like it.
So yeah, so I actually do. I saw your comment, and I kind of agree with what you're saying as far as, again, like you're going to use this book, you're going to take what you find valuable and then discard the rest. So like Jordan Peterson would say, search for your values. I don't think that's how David Goggins operates, unless his only value is like pushing through pain and steering the ship towards pain. Because I don't think the things that he does because he's passionate about them. So like, I don't think he's pursuing his passion as far as the examples you find in the book. I don't know if he really, as far as like the first, if you see in the example of the 100 miles, it wasn't like he's a passionate runner who loves to run. It's not like he loves to do pull-ups, and that's why he did that challenge and he's pursuing his passion. I think for him, and this is just me talking about David Goggins specifically, I think for him, he determined that his life's mission, let's call it that, is pushing past his pain points in whatever form that would take. And it'll take a multitude of forms. And in many cases, there'll be activities he doesn't like, because he talks about work and he's like, all right, I have this job. Because all of these activities he's doing, it's like they're outside of his normal job. He's working a 9-to-5 job like the majority of us. And he talks about this mentality of pushing yourself past your pain points into what's uncomfortable, even in your work. He's like, pretty much his idea is to be the best version of himself he can be. And to be his best version, it's going to be a trial, because he's going to have to push himself to do things he actually doesn't want to do. So as far as values, I think it could work. For him, I think it's that he says, hey, the things that I'm afraid of, the things that are going to cause me pain, I'm going to now focus on them, even when I don't like doing them. Because I think in the book, the majority of the things he does not like to do, he does them because he doesn't like to do them. So yeah, I do think it might be counter to the idea of pursuing your values, unless you can say, hey, my value is to be the best version of myself I can be, and you do that by doing the things that you're uncomfortable doing. Because in many cases, he says, I don't like to do this. I do it because I don't like to do it. And the value of pushing myself to do something I don't like to do that's uncomfortable, that is the value. That is the goal. That is the lesson. For him, it's not going to work for everyone. But that's, I think, his mindset, and that's how he shapes his life, I think, at least.
Okay, next, so it's going to be Tanya, Jason, and Diana. And Tanya, go ahead.
I just wanted to add on to the point, because sometimes finding a specific goal or figuring out your values can be overwhelming. We have so much information at like the touch of anything. You can look up whatever you want. So I think it really comes down to like accepting, like what was said, like a responsibility for your future is how you feel, how you prioritize your time, and like understanding what's in your control and how you can control it, because you can't really control, like I see a question about people being discouraging and supportive, but you can't really control how others will perceive what you're doing, and you kind of just have to do what's best for yourself and set yourself up for success, so that when you are feeling unmotivated and such, you don't need motivation, you just do it, you know.
Excellent, thank you. Next one up is Jason. Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, my question was, if your whole life you had bad advice, bad mentors, discouragement, unsupportive family and friends, how do you ignore everybody in your life and do what you want? That's been an issue I've had. Like, everything I wanted to do, people always look at the negative of it and say, don't do it. That's why I've always been in jobs that I don't like. And basically? How do you ignore everybody and just do whatever you want, even if they tell you it's wrong?
It's a good question. I don't have the answer for you. I could say that I don't think that in David Goggins' situation that happened to him again and again, because most of the things he pursued, people were they were a little weird. So the majority of people were like that. You should like they weren't encouraging. Yeah, go do that. They were doing the exact opposite, which is similar to what you're describing. I think for him, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm saying most people won't do that. If they feel like nobody in their life agrees with what they might want to do, it's scary to do it, because then you feel maybe you're wrong and they're right, and then you're afraid of failure, and then
Yeah, it's a tough one. I honestly don't. As far as David Goggins, I think somehow he decided to, I would say, listen to people less and listen to himself more, even if listening to himself would lead down a bad path. I think that was a decision he made. He would seek counsel and advice and do research. But again, for him, at least how I perceive him and from listening to him talk, is that in his mind, what he believes is possible is possible. It's just a question of, what do I need to do to make it possible? And that is enough of a motivation to circumnavigate any doubters. And that's tough to figure out in your own life. I know it's tough for myself.
Yeah, I mean, I've asked like people, like I used to go to like therapy and career counseling and all that, and nobody ever helped me with that question. That's why I'm still in the same situation, like a job I don't like and all that.
The only thing
that's so tough. Yeah,
like
sorry.
no, I've never gotten
Go ahead,
good
Chris.
advice in my life about anything.
The
about
only
what
advice
I should do.
Yeah, I think I took away from this book a little bit, and even other books, is that, right, you have your life, and at the end of the day, people can give you advice, but the consequences of that advice have nothing, they don't affect them. It only affects you. So that's what I've had to kind of learn. I learned that a little bit from this book, is that if you dream of something and you believe it, and you back it up with the faith and the truth and all the effort, what seems impossible can be made possible. But it's going to be hard.
And the older you get, the harder it is also. Like a lot of things I want to do now, I have to go back to school, and it's very hard to work full time and go to school, and so that makes more pressure on it financially.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's a very tough, the things that I think it does require a lot.
Right. Even if you want to change realistically with working these days in New York,
it takes
to go to school and work is like impossible.
Right. It takes a lot of courage, and it takes a lot of, I think what happens is that you can't really control people around you. They're going to be what they are. And ultimately, it is your life, and you have to make the hard decisions, and those are going to be hard decisions, and there is no easy way, no easy answer. It's mostly, it's all up to each of us, because each of us, our lives are different, and those choices are different, and each of us have to make those choices. Diana, you're next.
Yes. Going on here. I had several comments. Chachi, I found your comment was kind of hilarious. It seems to push past the pain. So I think the thing with the exercise, right? Because it's easy to get sidetracked with the whole obsessive kind of like. You would have asked me before what I thought about David Goggins, multi-mile runs. I thought it was awesome. And then towards the end of kind of my understanding and where I'm at now, I'm like, well, what were you running from? And then you feel like you still had to run several hundred miles to get away from it. But to not get sidetracked, I think the value there is important. Like, I think most of us would agree that our health is of utmost priority. It kind of is like the bedrock almost of what other things, goals, aspirations, and important things in our life stand on. If we don't have our health, it makes it very difficult to pretty much do anything else. Not impossible, it just makes it additionally challenging. So finding ways that exercise or maintaining your health, work for you that aren't necessarily quote unquote painful, maybe uncomfortable, maybe new, getting creative and trying to incorporate new ways of staying healthy physically, I think, is a step in that direction, and not necessarily going past that pain that most of us don't want to, like exercise, want to pursue. Also, if I can, I think for me, really the most important aspect of any kind of self-growth or kind of self, enhancing project or aspiration that I've had for myself is it requires a really like honest look at myself. When I do that, when I look at myself without feedback from other people, just like what my mind and what my experience tell me, well, I get a lot of sometimes uncomfortable realizations, things that I don't like, that I'm like, this is possibly my fault. And then it puts me in an empowering position where now I can start working towards that. So the level of honesty that I think is required for just anything, habits, goals, ambition, career planning, really taking responsibility for who you are, where you're at, not beating yourself up for it, and then, having, like Shukan said, maybe the courage to take one step in the general direction of improving that. So yeah.
Okay, next up is Ina. Ina, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I was thinking about it, and I think his goal is not just all this like running goals. He has a higher goal. He wants to be like uncommon, as he said, uncommon amongst uncommon. So he wants to achieve the excellence. And he wants, I think he also like an educator. He wants other people, he wants to inspire other people. That's why he wrote a book. I think that's his major motivation. Because like, remember how he goes like to different schools and he tells people like students about the SEALs and about the program, and he runs with them. He inspires them by example, and that's why he's doing it. He's not just doing it for himself. He's doing it like just for the community, for the little kids like he was. He wants them to overcome all the difficulties, I think. And also he has like charitable goals, because when he runs, he's raising money for the family of the fallen soldiers. So he has a lot of goals, which are very like, they're great goals. So that's why he's an inspiration, And also what I found very interesting, like I also run, but I run like 10 miles. So, but when I run, I love running. And for me, it's a great joy, right? For him, running is never a joy. He loves the pain. And like the pain for him, it's like a great stimulus. He loves pain because he loves to overcome it. So whenever he runs, he doesn't like it. He never likes what he does, but he still does it because when he overcomes it, he's like high on this overcoming. That's how he rolls. Yeah, that's what I think. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. So Chris, any closing thoughts?
No, this was fun. I liked what she just said. I agree with it like 100%. And yeah, he raises money for the families of fallen soldiers. I think that's his big charity right now, at least. Yeah.
All right, wonderful. So again, we do this every day at 9 p.m. Every weekday, and on the weekends at 2:30 p.m. And you're always welcome. We've run a little bit longer. I think we did a lot of discussion, a lot of back and forth. So, and it's already 10:30, so I'm going to dispense with a small group. I think this has been a fairly small group, so we've been able to kind of go back and forth. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you next time. Bye, and thank you very much, Chris. It was just wonderful, great presentation to put it together. Thanks. Bye.
See ya.
Thank you.
Bye.